the summer of 1882, a bartender in Tombstone, Arizona, dropped a chunk of ice into a glass of lemonade. Outside, the temperature was 108 degrees. That ice had been cut from a river in Maine 6 weeks earlier, hauled by wagon, shipped by sea, and raced across 2,000 miles of continent in a sawdust-packed rail car. Somehow it arrived still frozen. What built that chain, and what eventually destroyed it, is one of the most consequential forgotten chapters in the history of the American West. The frontier towns of the late 1870s and 1880s are remembered for their extremes: punishing heat, choking dust, and the kind of hardship that became legend. Yet Tombstone, Tucson, and Deadwood, where summer temperatures routinely cleared 100 degrees, boasted thriving ice cream parlors and saloons advertising ice-cold beer. By the early 1880s, these weren't novelties. They were signals of status, of civilization, of something larger reaching into the desert. In some territories, a block of ice fetched a higher price per pound than gold. The empire that made this possible was built by one man far from any desert. Frederick Tudor was a Boston merchant's son who, in 1806, had an idea that everyone around him thought was insane. He would cut ice from New England's frozen rivers in winter, pack it in sawdust, and ship it to places that had never seen a frozen lake in their lives: the Caribbean, South America, India. His neighbors called him the Ice Fool. Newspapers mocked him. His first shipment to Martinique arrived partially melted, and he nearly went bankrupt. He tried again. By the 1820s, Tudor's operation was turning a profit. By the 1840s, his ice was being served in Calcutta, preserved all the way from Maine by nothing more than sawdust, insulated holds, and an obsessive attention to packing technique. Tudor proved something that changed the world: that frozen water, properly managed, could be among the most valuable commodities on Earth. He became known as the Ice King, and his success opened the door for an industry that most people today have never thought about for a single moment. Tudor proved it could be done across oceans. A new generation of icemen would prove it could be done across a continent, and the stakes, if anything, were higher. The harvesting itself was a spectacle worth witnessing. Each winter, on the Kennebec River and the other frozen waterways of New England, teams of men went to work with hand saws and iron pikes, cutting blocks up to 2 feet thick from the river's surface. The work was brutal: cold that cracked skin, ice that could swallow a man whole if he stepped wrong. And it was also, by the standards of the era, extraordinarily well organized. Blocks were lifted by horse-drawn machinery onto sledges and hauled directly into massive ice houses along the bank. These structures could hold thousands of tons. Sawdust, a plentiful byproduct of New England's timber industry, packed between and around the blocks, served as insulation. Properly buried, ice could survive for months, even as summer temperatures climbed outside. By the mid-1800s, Boston ice companies were exporting more than 50,000 tons a year. The ice houses dotted riverbanks and railroad sidings from Maine to New Jersey, standing as silent witnesses to a trade that few noticed and almost everyone depended on. But harvesting was only the beginning. The real question isn't how they cut the ice. It's how, once it left those New England rivers, it survived long enough to reach a saloon in the Arizona desert, and what happened to the men whose fortunes depended on it getting there. Before the railroads, ice traveled by wagon and steamship, sometimes as far as New Orleans, sometimes across the tropics in insulated holds. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 and the Southern Pacific's subsequent push into Arizona through the 1870s and 1880s changed everything. What had taken weeks by sea could now be accomplished in days by rail. Specially built cars, insulated with sawdust and tar paper, carried their frozen cargo south and west, racing against the summer sun. Those rail cars were in a race with physics. Every mile south, the heat pressed harder. By the time a shipment reached Tucson, the men unloading it could tell from the weight of each block exactly how many hours it had left. What they did with those hours and how they priced them made some of them very rich and ruined others completely. Records from the Southern Pacific in the early 1880s confirm that ice shipments arrived in Tucson on a regular schedule. This was no small development. Businesses that had never been able to offer anything cold suddenly drew crowds. Those who controlled the local ice supply held economic power that rivaled saloon owners and land barons. The weekly arrival of the ice train became a celebrated event, and the men who managed the distribution networks that followed it became some of the most quietly influential figures on the frontier. For the saloon keepers and restaurateurs of the arid West, ice meant more than cold lager and a proper glass of lemonade. It meant a brief, miraculous victory against the desert's grand indifference. They watched the dusty road from the rail depot with a keenness usually reserved for poker hands and approaching marshals. The Tucson Gazette ran regular columns chronicling each day's shipment, detailing not just the tonnage landed, but the quality and clarity of the blocks themselves. The best grades, known as diamond ice from the Kennebec, were said to ring like a bell when dropped on flagstone. The men who stacked these blocks in their cellars nursed a pride as sharp and private as any silver load. Old advertisements and newspaper reports fill in the rest of the picture. Tombstone saloons and Deadwood's hotels offered ice-cold beer and chilled lemonade. Ice cream, previously impossible outside major eastern cities, became a sought-after treat. Fresh milk stayed fresh longer. Diets changed. Routines changed. One frontier paper marveled in print. Ice in Arizona. The luxury of the eastern states has found its way to the parched throats of our citizens. Even Wyatt Earp understood the drawing power of a cold drink. His Tombstone saloon advertised chilled whiskey and beer, pulling in travelers, gamblers, and townspeople who might otherwise have gone elsewhere. For many of them, a glass of something cold was more than refreshment. It was a reminder of the world they'd left behind, a taste of stability in a place where stability was never guaranteed. But the ice melted. That was always the trick of it. No matter how tightly they banked the walls with sawdust, the blocks shed weight every day, leaving little rivers in the dirt that darkened the earth and drew the wild dogs in from the outskirts. In the hottest months, as much as half of each shipment could be lost before it ever reached a customer. Some loads arrived as little more than puddles. Others, expertly packed and rushed through on a fast train, came out nearly intact. This unpredictability sent prices soaring in summer and sent the icemen themselves into a perpetual state of managed anxiety, watching the sky and the railroad schedules with equal intensity. For the regulars, tin miners, Civil War strays, cowhands still rubbing the sleep from their eyes, ice wasn't luxury. They'd never have called it that. They called it the only thing worth stealing. And once, in the spring of a bad year, when the train stopped running for 2 weeks and the ice houses ran dry, they blamed a murder on the lack of it. The inquest was half serious, but only half. A man had been killed in a Tombstone saloon after 2 weeks of unbroken heat and nothing cold to drink. The judge noted the circumstances. Men who might have cooled their tempers over a cold glass had nothing to cool them with. Whether the ruling was meant as dark humor or genuine attribution is not entirely clear. What is clear is that by that point, ice had stopped being comfort. It had become infrastructure, and when it ran out, people noticed what it had been holding together. That precariousness is what ultimately drove the next chapter of the story and ended the old one permanently. The machine that killed the natural ice trade didn't look like much. An ammonia compressor, a series of pipes, an insulated room. By the late 1870s, engineers in the East had developed mechanical refrigeration capable of producing ice artificially year-round, without rivers, without winter, without sawdust. The first commercial ice plants appeared in New Orleans and San Antonio in the early 1880s, clean, consistent, immune to weather and rail delays. For the old icemen who had spent decades building distribution networks and racing shipments across a continent, It was over in less than a decade. Towns that had once depended entirely on the ice train could now produce their own blocks a mile from the saloon. The vast ice houses they'd built to last a century stood empty by 1900. Some burned. Most simply collapsed slowly, their sawdust-stained walls fallen back into the earth alongside the railroad sidings where the ice trains had once pulled in before dawn. The legacy of natural ice, though, lingered long after the last Kennebec block sweated itself into a desert gutter. In the saloons and boarding houses of the boom towns, old-timers told stories about winters so cold a man's breath froze in his beard, and railroad workers shivered at the memory even as the dust outside baked to powder by noon. Sometimes, when the evening cooled just enough, the men on the porch of the Cosmopolitan Hotel would swear the wind carried a chill off the river, a ghost of the ice trade, present and unacknowledged. Why has this story been so thoroughly forgotten? In part because its success depended on staying invisible. Silent trains pulling in before sunrise, laborers shoveling sawdust in the shadows, a supply chain hidden behind saloon doors and beneath the streets of daily life. Historians focused on the gunfights and the gold strikes and overlooked the infrastructure that made those towns function. But without ice, without the refrigeration networks, the engineered ice houses, the carefully packed rail cars, the civilization that grew up in those frontier towns would have been radically, materially different. The march of progress in the American West relied on more than courage and luck. It depended on planning, logistics, and the accumulated expertise of men who understood exactly how long a block of Kennebec ice would last in Arizona heat, and who built their lives around that knowledge. Every time a cowboy in Tombstone ordered a cold beer, every time a child in Tucson tasted ice cream for the first time, they were participating in a global chain of ingenuity, one that stretched from the frozen rivers of New England to the sun-baked streets of the desert Southwest. The ice trade stands as proof that even in the harshest environments, determined people could deliver comfort and modernity in ways that now seem almost unimaginable. Today, traces of that industry survive only in the ruins of old stone ice houses, faded newspaper advertisements, and a handful of yellowed shipping records. Yet the legacy is there every time we drop a cube into a glass, every time we take a cold drink for granted without thinking about the 2,000 miles and 6 weeks of ingenuity that once had to stand behind it. Civilization in the West wasn't built on boldness alone. It was built on the quiet, relentless work of those who made the impossible routine. And that story deserves to be told. If you value history told with accuracy and depth, consider subscribing for more stories that reveal the real foundations of frontier life. And if you have memories, family stories, or knowledge of other overlooked comforts and innovations that shaped the West, we'd be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below.